All right, so picking up where we left off with Schopenhauer, we're going to, in this video, talk in a little bit more detail about his relationship to Plato's philosophy, his notion of the Platonic idea and how that ties into his philosophy of art. And we'll also introduce this concept of the will-less subject, which is kind of like for him, I guess, the proper state to be in to gain insight or knowledge or truth from our aesthetic experience. This is the quote that we read from the last video, but let's start this one with the quote that we already read it, but let's go over it again, and then we'll move on, okay? So, again, he says art's aim, Schopenhauer says art's aim is the facilitating of the knowledge of the ideas of the world. And again, he means knowledge in the Platonic sense. The ideas, however, are essentially something perceptible, which therefore in its fuller determinations is inexhaustible. The communication of such an idea can therefore only take place on the path of perception, which is that of art. Whoever, therefore, is filled with the comprehension of an idea is justified if he chooses art as the medium of its communication. Remember, there's a lot of things that are surprising about this quote. If you know anything about Plato, right, first off the bat is that the ideas are perceptible, right? For Plato, they were knowable through the mind, but not perceptible. So that's something that we're going to have to kind of iron out here as we go through Schopenhauer. What does he mean they're perceptible? Kind of hinted at it a little bit in the last video, but when we actually look at art and his examples that he uses, maybe it'll become a little bit more clear what he means, that the ideas are perceptible. Another thing too is that art is a good way to get to truth, to communicate the ideas. Another thing Plato would not have probably been on board with. So what's the new stuff? What are we getting to now? We are only perfectly satisfied, Schopenhauer says. We're only perfectly satisfied by the impression of a work of art when it leaves something which, with all our thinking about it, we cannot bring down to this distinctness of a conception. This is something where he's in line with Kant. Remember what Kant said, that the beautiful is not based on a concept. My judgment of beauty is not based on a conception. It's based on my experience, right? He's saying something similar, right? You can't really, why is Shakespeare awesome and deep and whatever? You can't bring it down to the distinctness of a conception. Therefore, it is an undertaking as unworthy as it is absurd if, as has often been tried at the present day, one seeks to reduce a poem of Shakespeare's or Goethe's to the abstract truth which it was its aim to communicate. Again, he shares this with Kant. This is a sentiment straight from the third critique, right? It's folly, it's absurd to demand of the artist to put in some formula, some rational formula, what his work of art represents. Now, this is another thing Plato would not have liked. Remember, if you ever read the Apology with Socrates going and talking to the artist, one of his big beefs with the artist was that they said many wise things and that their poems were full of wisdom, but yet they couldn't explain their poems, right? So that was a demerit on the part of, the poets, said Plato, said Socrates, that they couldn't explain it. But for Schopenhauer, for Kant, this is not something we should assume or we should demand of the artist, right? And in a way, Plato himself, he's kind of on the hook for this a bit when he talks about the ideas. One of the big criticisms against Plato is that when you get to his account, his explanation of the ideas, they tend to be very vague, right? For instance, in the Symposium, we read that earlier this semester in this course, that part where we get to the beautiful in the Symposium, it's beautiful not this way, not that way, not in something, not on the earth, not in a hand, not in anything perceptible. What the heck is it? It's a word, right? Now, some Platonists and Neoplatonists will argue that what Plato is telling us is that in a certain sense you get to this direct perception is the wrong word, but that's the only word we may have. This direct intuition maybe is better of knowledge. Your mind just knows the beautiful, right? And it's all the other things that you think are beautiful. you think they're beautiful based on this understanding you have of the true beauty, the idea of the beautiful. But it's this completely abstract concept, this idea that's independent of you, outside of space and time, and all other beautiful things draw their beauty from it. And your understanding of those beautiful things as beautiful is only based on this beauty itself, which is just not explainable in words either. It's just something directly known by the soul in Plato, right? So that's one interpretation of Plato where this kind of fits in. But again, he argues against the poets in the Apology. At least Socrates seems to think that they're at fault because they can't explain the poems that they wrote. Even though the poems are filled with wisdom, they don't even understand them. So that's not wisdom, that's not knowledge. Now, so Schopenhauer says that certainly the artist ought to think in the arranging of his work, but only that thought which was perceived before it was thought has afterwards in its communication the power of animating or rousing, and thereby becomes imperishable. Right, so it's fine that the artist, has to think about how is he going to produce this work of art, but as long as the thought it was based on was some direct perception, a direct inspiration, right? We shall not refrain from observing here that certainly the work which is done at a stroke, like the sketches of painters already referred to, we talked about that in the last video, the work which is completed in the inspiration of its first conception, and as it were unconsciously dashed off like the melody, which comes entirely without reflection, and quite as if by inspiration, that all these, they have the great advantage of being purely the work of the ecstasy of the moment, the inspiration, the free movement of genius, without any admixture of intention and reflection. Hence, they are through and through delightful and enjoyable, without shell and kernel, and their effect is much more inevitable than that of the greatest works of art, of slower and more deliberate execution. So he's making a pretty general claim here. Again, him and Kant are having a little battle here. He definitely is different with Kant in this regard. We already went over this point earlier, that the artist creates at a flash, right? Something directly perceived, the way that Plato or Platonists might say we directly perceive the ideas with our soul. The artist directly perceives it and communicates it through the work, and that's why when you look at these works like the sketches and like Picasso here with his light drawings, right, and the photographer Jean Milly, right, the famous photos on Life magazine, right, these are all done and they have a more striking effect on us, right, than other works of art that are slower and more deliberately made. So now we get to, like I said earlier, we're going to talk about this notion of the will-less subject, right? So how do we contemplate works of art properly? Schopenhauer is going to give us a tour. And I mentioned how some of his thought, his philosophy, his thought, it definitely aligns with the work of some of the Buddhist philosophers of the past, the Buddha himself, and a lot of Hindu Vedantic philosophy. And this is really going to be apparent in the next few slides when we talk about his concept of the will-less subject. So what does he say here? He says, in the aesthetical mode of contemplation, we have found two inseparable constituent parts. Just like in all experience, there are these two parts, the subject and the object, that can't be separated from one another without having nothing left. Without some empty husk being left. In an aesthetical mode of contemplation, there are also these other two parts, right? What are they? They're the knowledge of the object, not as an individual thing, but as a Platonic idea. So I'm seeing the object, but I'm understanding its universality in the Platonic sense. So that's one of the constituent parts of aesthetical contemplation. And the other is the enduring form of this whole species of things. That's not the other. That's an elaboration of what he means by Platonic idea. The other part of aesthetical contemplation is the self-consciousness of the knowing person, not as an individual. I'm not aware of myself as an individual, but as pure, will-less subject of knowledge, right? So I kind of botched that, so let's back up a bit, right? So there's two constituent parts that are inseparable in our aesthetic mode of contemplation when we're having an experience of proper aesthetic experience of works of art, right? So these two constituent parts are one, the knowledge of the object, not as an individual thing, but as a Platonic idea, that is, as the enduring form of this whole species of things. When I see a painting of a lion, we're going to get to one of those later, it's like a representative of all lions and what it is to be a beautiful lion, what it is to be a good lion, and what it is to be the ultimate lion. That's what the work of art, that's what the painting or the sculpture of the lion is supposed to try to bring forth. That's one of the parts. That's one of the constituent elements. The other is the self-consciousness of the knowing person, not as an individual, not as aware of myself as Travis giving a lecture on Schopenhauer, but as a will-less subject of knowledge, a pure will-less subject of knowledge. I'm just merely contemplating it attached. That also is a big Kantian. So it's almost like, this is maybe a good quote where you get a mixture of his Kantianism and his Platonism all at once, right? You've got this one part, the idea, that's the work of art as a representative of the species. And then you have the subject that's will-less. That's the Kantian part, right? Aesthetic experience has to be disinterested, remember? So there's the Platonic idea on the one hand, that on the one side, and the will-less subject on the other. The condition under which both these constituent parts appear, always united, was found to be the abandonment of the method of knowing which is bounded by the principle of sufficient reason. I'll talk about what that is in a minute, right? What is the principle of sufficient reason? So the condition under which these parts are always united was found to be the abandonment. You give up, you abandon this method, this normal method of knowing, the usual method by which you know something. You abandon that, and that method is the principle of sufficient reason. Again, more on that later. You let go of that, and this condition is also, on the other hand, the only kind of knowledge that is of value for the service of the will and also for science. This condition of being bounded by the principle of sufficient reason, not the one we're talking about, not the will-less subject, right? So what he's saying in this first sentence is that if in the second half of the first sentence is if you're going to do science or you're going to service your will, in other words, guide your actions and do something practical, you have to be bounded by this principle, which we'll talk about a little bit, not much, in the next slide. So all other knowledge is sort of like this, but aesthetic contemplation, right, we'll see that the pleasure which is produced by the contemplation, the beautiful, aesthetic contemplation, arises from these two constituent parts, right? You know, you have to abandon the principle of sufficient reason in order for these constituent parts to come forth. And so the beautiful arises from these, and sometimes more from one than the other. This is interesting. Sometimes more from the other, according to what the object of the aesthetical contemplation may be. In other words, when I'm experiencing a work of art and I'm having this experience of the idea, sometimes it's the idea, the Platonic idea, that is more of prominence, and sometimes it's the will-less subject that is more of prominence. It all depends on what type of object it is, what type of work of art is it. Different works of art will bring forth more the idea, and others will allow me to be more will-less, right? And so there'll be more objective art and more subjective art to keep it sort of more, to keep it simpler. Okay, so I promised I would explain the principle of sufficient reason, and I'm not really going to. There's a lot here. I'm going to leave this slide for you guys on the PowerPoint if you want to read all that Schopenhauer has to say about this principle. But here, this is another area where he disagrees with Kant. And it's not in the context of art. It's actually in general. He disagrees with Kant. Remember, Kant thinks that our experience is organized by the relationship between our perceptions and our categories, right? We have perceptions, and all of us are hardwired. We all have different perceptions, but we all have the same categories that organize those perceptions, and there's 12 of them. We didn't go over them, that's not important, but he thinks there's 12. Schopenhauer says, no, everything really is all based on this one principle, and there's 4 versions of it. We're not going to go over the 4 versions of it, but the basic principle is this, is that everything has to have a reason or a cause, right? So basically, why is it there? What's its purpose? How is it good for me? Is it good for you? Is it good for anything? This is sort of the mode of knowledge, right? I'm keeping it pretty simple. There's a lot more to it. If there are some big Schopenhauer fans who end up watching this video later and getting mad, look, this is a philosophy of art class, so I'm trying to keep it simple, right? But the idea is everything has a reason or a cause. But when we're contemplating works of art, we have this sort of will-less contemplation, this pure knowledge, not the knowledge based on this principle. It's a sort of detachment, right? We're not looking for a reason. We're not looking for what's in it for me or why, and we're just experiencing the work of art. Okay, so we give that up, right? Otherwise, we're a willful subject, right? And this is a constant thing. This is also totally, I mean, if he's not ripping off Buddhism, I don't know, or Hinduism, I think really, he was really a fan of the Upanishads more than anything else, those ancient Hindu texts, right? And some of the Vedas, other Vedas. But this seems like it could come straight from the mouth of the Buddha himself. I mean, it's kind of more technical the way, Kant's jargon is, but he talks about how all willing, and this is most willing, most of us that are human beings are in this constant state. We're not a will-less subject. He says that all willing arises from want, or desire, dukkha, if you're a Buddhist, right? So all willing arises from want, therefore from deficiency, and therefore from suffering. The satisfaction of a wish ends it. Yet for one wish that is satisfied, there remain at least 10 which are denied. Further, the desire lasts long, the demands are infinite, the satisfaction is short and scantily measured out. So long as our consciousness is filled by our will, so long as we are given up to the throng of desires, with their constant hopes and fears, so long as we are the subject of willing, we can never have lasting happiness nor peace. Right? Again, this is, life is suffering, says the Buddha, right? Or, dukkha, if you want to get technical. Life is dukkha, right? It's unsatisfaction. It's always one satisfaction is followed by a dissatisfaction. One wish fulfillment is followed by a new wish. But so there's a way to get out of this, right? There's a sort of a temporary relief from this, a sort of temporary escape from this condition, and it's the will-less subject. Right? When some external cause or inward disposition lifts us suddenly out of the endless stream of willing, delivers knowledge from the slavery of the will, the attention is no longer directed to the motives of willing, but comprehends things free from their relation to the will, and thus observes them without personal interest, without subjectivity, purely objectively, gives itself entirely up to them so far as they are ideas, but not so far as they are motives. Then all at once, the peace which we were always seeking, but which always fled from us on the former path of the desires, comes to us of its own accord, as it is well with us. Right? So it's this sort of, I've got this picture of the Buddhist monk, meditating here on the lake, this sort of tranquil scene, right? This is, I guess, sort of a visual representation, I think, of what he's trying to describe here, right? Somehow this external cause, this work of art that we see, it draws us to this plane of contemplation or this inward disposition, right? Maybe through meditative practice, we're able to lift ourselves out of this endless cycle of desire and insufficiency and constant craving for more. And so we find this inner peace and this pure contemplation, right? We give ourselves up entirely to it insofar as it's an idea, but not insofar as it's a motive, for our action or our wants and our needs. But this is just the state which I described above as necessary for the knowledge of the idea. You have to be in this state to understand and to really get this direct experience, this immediate experience of that Platonic idea that he's talking about, that that particular representation of this universal truth. This is just the state which I described as necessary for knowledge of the idea, as pure contemplation, as sinking oneself in perception, losing oneself in the object, forgetting all individuality, surrendering that kind of knowledge which follows the principle of sufficient reason and comprehends only relations, the state by means of which at once and inseparably the perceived particular thing is raised to the idea of the whole species, and the knowing individual to the pure subject of will-less knowledge. And as such, they are both taken out of the stream of time and all other relations. So Plato was right. It's outside of time, outside of space, kind of. That's how it's experienced. It is then all one, whether we see the sun set from prison or from the palace, right? We lose ourselves, we're one with all. And that's truly what is, given his metaphysics, that's truly the way everything is. It's all will. Everything is all will. The world is will, and the representation of that will to itself, right? Says Schopenhauer, right? So this is our direct comprehension of our oneness with the universe and with truth. And this is hard to maintain, right? He says, but it's, we can produce this state in us. He says this inward disposition, the predominance of knowing over willing, right? Just detaching ourselves and just becoming one with all of our surroundings, with the world and the will. We can produce this state, right? Our inward disposition can produce this state under any circumstances, right? I used to take meditation classes here in Houston, and I remember my shifu once said that his shifu, when he was first a disciple, said the best place to meditate is the supermarket, right? If you can meditate there, you can meditate anywhere, right? So you gotta got that chattery monkey mind, you gotta shut it up. And if you're a good practitioner and you do your meditation well, eventually you'll reach a state where this inward disposition can be produced under any circumstances, right? Even in the marketplace, even in a crowded marketplace. All right, I think we're going to end the video on this slide here, but let's read the quote. Let's unpack it. We're getting into the section where we're going to start talking about. We're going to introduce Schopenhauer's notion of what a genius is. It's a little different from Kant. There's some similarities, right? But there's a difference. But let's wrap up this point he's making about the will-less subject and this notion of pure contemplation. So near us always lies a sphere in which we escape from all our misery. But who has the strength to continue long in it? As soon as any single relation to our will, to our person, even of these objects of our pure contemplation, comes again into consciousness, the magic is at an end, right? So we're having this wonderful experience of a work of art, and it's great. We lose ourselves. We become one with this sort of flow of nature, with this sort of stream of all reality, and we lose ourselves, right? And we are an object of pure knowing. And then all of a sudden we're like, oh crap, I gotta go to the grocery store. I forgot to get butter, right? That's gonna come back, right? Then the magic is at an end. But again, if we have the right inward disposition, if we're what he calls a saint, or we have this artistic genius, we are able to find these moments of repose a lot easier than maybe others might, right? Than other people who aren't, I guess, trained in these arts or have the capacity for it, as Schopenhauer might say. Okay, well, this again is a good place to stop the video. We'll again say more about his notion of artistic genius in the next one, and there's even some more stuff. I think we might even have time in the next video to get into some of his direct comments on the different arts and how, you know, we previewed earlier how some arts are more subjective and more arts are objective depending on how they affect us, and I think we might even have time for that in the next one. So let's stop it here, and we'll see you in the next one, hopefully.